Greetings. Welcome to Wake the Dead. Today we are very delighted to have good friend Carrie Olaje to the show. Welcome, Carrie.
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much for having me back again.
It's a pleasure. This place is your home too. We love to hear your voice here, and we learn so much. What your voice has given us is such a gift, and thank you so much. If anybody wants to know who you are or what you've done, please check out the earlier episodes with Carrie. She is a experiencer of a very wild life, and she I don't know how to explain it, but we love her and we're glad to have her here. And she's teaching us very much about the satanic ritual abuse and the mind abuse of trauma-based mind control. And the structure, the last show that we spoke with Carrie about, we discussed the internal scripts, structures, and hierarchies of the internal programs, and the hierarchy of the altars, and who holds the keys. And we're going to get further into that today. And you've released some 3 new episodes on your YouTube channel, which delve further into Persecutor parts, Gatekeeper altars, and I hope to speak a little bit about that as well today. So thank you again. Hello. Hey, have you, I guess I don't know how to start this, but let's...
No worries.
I always do this. But anyway, so okay, from before we had the scripts, which were a template. It's the narrative outline of the internal worlds. Now we can imagine like Wizard of Oz and that type of script, right? And we have the structures, which organizes the vast number of parts to be 100% familiar to the programmer for access.
Yes.
The programmer has codes and triggers. We're going to be speaking more about those today. Actually, would you like to start with the triggers? We'll get into hierarchy after when we get to the persecuted parts, but tell us, what is a trigger and how does that affect what is internally installed already in your mind?
For sure. So, I mean, the way I would usually kind of broach the topic of triggers is that, like, with something that's like maybe a little bit more familiar to people, than when I usually call it like manipulated dissociation, so that's the ritual abuse, the organized abuse, the, satanic ritual abuse, the more military mind control, all of these things are kind of based off of the same thing, which is manipulating the natural dissociative response of a child that's going through intense trauma. So if we just look at like triggers in general, the best thing for people, I think, is that everyone's really familiar with, war veterans, maybe hearing like a firecracker going off or something. And essentially they'll be hiding under the table or something and not recognizing that they're like at a 4th of July barbecue or something like that. And that's something that maybe for a lot of people isn't something that they've never personally experienced, but I think it's like familiar enough in just life, with the number of war veterans we have, or the way it's been presented on TV, many times, or movies, that, they can really conceptualize like, okay, like this person went through a really traumatic event. And if there's like a sound, a smell, something that reminds the brain, enough of that previous experience, that they are, their consciousness is completely shifting out of their current reality and into a past event, essentially, to where they're like, okay, I'm in the middle of the battlefield now, like there's like, I'm being shot at, my friend is next to me bleeding out or something like that, so the person's like not just their emotional, kind of internal landscape, but also, like what they feel like they're seeing, hearing physically, like where they're at in time, has completely shifted, and they have to do something to get grounded again in like their present reality. So when you're a child going through traumatic events, especially if they're repeated, then what essentially you're dealing with is, if we look at, natural dissociation, which is just, a kid maybe going through incest or something, and it would be for those people that are DID that isn't manipulated at all by their abusers, it would be, maybe the smell of the abuser's cologne, or, a certain kind of cigarette or alcohol, that, was something that they would, would indicate to them that their abuser was about to become abusive. Basically, it could be sounds, it could be smells, it could be, visual things, like someone like looking or having mannerisms like their abuser, essentially in all these instances, that's just how the trigger works. Is it's like our brain's way of like internalizing, like, okay, a trauma event is about to happen, I better dissociate into this part that is used to opening up to wall off, that trauma from the rest of my consciousness, in reality, to, save the kid's psyche, basically. So when you're dealing with, that would just be like, incest or something like that. So when you're dealing with manipulated dissociation and mind control type of stuff, and ritual abuse, it's basically, the programmer, the abusers understand that this is how your brain works in conjunction with dissociation. So they intentionally like weaponize these triggers and catalog these triggers, basically, so that they can, like Pavlov's dog or something, that they can introduce to the survivor a, a verbal cue, maybe a numerical code. It could be certain songs, or, sounds like tones, basically, or like frequencies. Visual stuff could be, certain like images or symbols, or, in my case, I had a lot of experience with like hand signals that would usually initiate like the first, switch essentially into like the cult trained personalities or the military trained personalities. I was going to say there's, and then usually these are basically, post trauma programmed, so it's going to be like keyed to the individual part that was going through a specific trauma, and then afterwards being trained into, performing certain roles either within the system or externally, having certain access to certain skills that they don't want them to normally display in their like everyday life, because it would be weird, if a kid was, acting out violently or sexually, it's like it'll start sending up red flags for all the people in their life that they don't want to know that the kid's being used. Or it can be like post hypnotic, and sometimes drugs are involved with that as well, so like literally putting the kid through like actual like hypnosis, essentially, in addition to the trauma, which really like further ingrains these, these different triggers, to where, they have, like their little notebook or something, some of them can remember most of them, but it's also like you have so many trauma events that a lot of times, they'll have them like cataloged in some way, the handlers will, to where they understand the triggers for parts, and then also like where those parts exist kind of like within the system, so that they can call them out as needed, to exploit like whatever it is that they have from that child, essentially, and then into adulthood too, because that's the whole point of a lot of this, is that, if you're a trained asset, their ideal is that they'll be able to use you, throughout your life. So they'll be able to get many years, many years out of this, to where, you could be, you could be in your 20s, but they're still pulling out like a 5-year-old part that was trained to be a certain way, basically, and your mentality will switch to a degree. But yeah, so I'm gonna take a break here for a
Oh,
drink. I
good.
have
That's
allergies
fine.
right now, so I'm sorry for everyone if like my voice sounds a little weird here or there.
Your voice is beautiful, and we're glad that it's speaking your words. Um, so the DDoNOS that you spoke about earlier, or in your
Mm-hmm.
other episodes, um, that is like the scientific way of, this is the like the, you got like Danny Lloyd, who has a split alter by accident because he was being raped by Jack Torrance, right? But
Mm-hmm.
then you also have Helena, who, or Alice or whatever, in Eyes Wide Shut, who like, they have specific triggers, and are brought up at specific times for specific reasons and for specific people to have,
Mm-hmm.
like, so like that categorization allows for certain users to use you in certain ways, and then the other parts inside aren't affected, right? So they can like
Yeah.
loan you out for sex, and then your dog alters don't know any of that, and they're not being affected, right? And
Yeah, exactly. You'll have usually groups of the system that have like variations on the same skills. There's like a lot of people know like what's really common in programming, is like carousel type programming, which is like where like different parts are like grouped and then arranged almost in like, a circular pattern in the structure to where, you can access like the which we call it, like like the child prostitution, trafficking side of the person, and it's like, okay, well, what client do we have?
all
How is
right,
it that
is it
how
the
is it that they?
bestiality client, or is it the dominatrix client, or like that
Yeah,
sort of thing?
exactly. Like they want to know essentially, like it's like some people are going to want like a child that behaves like really like innocent and like naive. Other people are going to want a part that acts like a complete adult,
Right.
sexualized, and like is the one taking the lead in the situation, or like you said, like, bestiality, this person wants a dominatrix, all these different, things to where it's like, okay, which part are we accessing? Or if we were looking at, assassination parts, what is the particular, or ritual parts, like what is the particular scenario that this child is going to be going into? And what are the particular skills that are needed? Sometimes a part will have many skills, but a lot of times to like kind of increase the customize ability of like what they call out, that's like when you're going to have groups of parts, and each one has been trained very specific skills essentially. And that's kind of like where I had mentioned, like wanting to talk about the control room today, is like it's part of like a physical structure in a lot of DDNOS systems, so, and that's like where DID is a lot of times characterized by complete amnesic switches essentially, and in between these different parts that have been created, and the same for like DDNOS. But there's also a lot of times like a lot of like masking the of the switches by the control room, but then also the ability to have like multiple parts out at once, basically, so that it is kind of creating the particular cocktail, the particular recipe, the particular team that the handler
I
wants,
see.
in this
So
situation.
one of the alters can be servicing the client, while the other alter is like spiking his drink or telling him something that she was programmed to say. And then another
Accurate.
alter can be like looking through his wallet and like getting other information or whatever,
Yeah. It's essentially, like if exactly like you're describing, kind of like a typical honeypot type of situation where it's like you have, they're sent in presenting on the front as like their like whatever prostitute altar we're talking about, and then what you end up having is like other altars that are there along for the ride that are looking, for their opportune moment for them to do whatever they were assigned to do in that situation. So one altar is assigned to be, whatever style of child prostitute you need to be at the time. Other altars are there to either, have kind of the real motivation. Sometimes it is just the prostitution if you're talking about money, but a lot of times we're dealing with like the ritual abuse or, especially the military abuse, then what you're really dealing with is like there's an ulterior motive, that the sexual situation is just the setup so that you can then, like you're saying, be drugging someone, be, spying, be, hurting them in some instances.
Right, murdering, like have the murder altar there too. Like the horror altar is doing whatever.
So, yeah, exactly.
Right. So, you had an instance when Prawn Malkovich saw like you had a wrong altar out, and he likes the ones that look down and don't look at what he's doing when he's like raping a child to death, and you stared at him because your altar is not trained to do that altar, the dominatrix one, and then that caused 3 years of extreme discomfort for your life.
Yeah. So, and that was like a good instance of like showing how programming can essentially break down, or like it can be threatened by, an alter being put in a situation that they're not like trained for, essentially, and that was like a lot of the issue with like my experience with like Prawn Malkovich is like, I had been brought to that party in the dominatrix role, like that was going to be, that was there with, a particular program within herself, too, that was, basically called like stone face, where basically, she was meant to be like I was like 7 at the time, like meant to be like a little psychopath, essentially, so it was one of Gates's favorite altars because this altar, was trained to be a sexual sadist and was trained to kind of be one of the main hierarchy, kind of gatekeepers for the not just the dominatrix stuff, but the kind of more military assassination type training and stuff like that, the violence related stuff. So we were there at the party being hired so that I could perform like a dominatrix style floor show, with bestiality and different stuff involved, essentially. So that's the altar that I was in. And the other altars that were also there in the control room for a few varying skills, we're all meant to be, supporting that same persona, essentially. And when Prawn saw, that it's like I was, not reacting to him, essentially like trying to rape a boy to death, it to him was like a sign of defiance, was a sign of like challenge, like that I was a slave that didn't know my place. Cause I mean, I was sitting there on a leash, I was like meant to, even though I was, seen as a predator, was seen as like a predator, that was in captivity and still knew whatever. But it doesn't matter. So essentially,
it does matter, but they can listen to it in another episode. We already talked about it. Please continue. Yes.
Yeah,
it does matter.
So but essentially, like that's what he got off on was was his idea that he was going to like break me, essentially, and that defiance that he saw. But the only reason it was out was because Gates, Julius William Gates, my handler, had, triggered those altars, and that's the part that was out. Like if Malkovich, Prawn, wanted to have wanted to have
a demure,
like the demure, exactly.
Right.
If he wanted to have like the demure, like innocent part, like Gates could have easily pulled that out of me. Right. But what he got off on was this idea that he was like really creating this like humiliation and demeaning and everything of a part that like, wasn't, that he was going to break me essentially and show me my place, etc.
Sick individual.
And because Gates is very like, he had like a lot of like kind of like envy and admiration and like kind of like FOMO and shit when it came to dealing with celebrities. It's like more than I saw him with anything else, because I think he kind of like had always wanted to be in their role as opposed to to having to be like the big bad military guy, which he was, and played that part to like the nth degree if you read anything about him.
Yeah.
But essentially, he was willing to risk my programming to essentially each time I went to see, Prawn, not just at that party, but then 2 times after that, he pulled out this part that he knew was going to be, put through what a different one of my parts, the masochist would have been okay with, and was trained to handle, you know what I mean? But it was a part, that she was like the whole point of like an assassin part is you really need this like supreme kind of confidence. It's like, the battle for a lot of times is won by like the attitude of the victor is essentially, this kind of them not having any room in their mind that they're going to lose, and that's a lot of like what characterized this part. So, if you're built to have supreme confidence and like no emotion and stuff, and then you're forcing that part into being traumatized to the point of, it essentially was breaking down the walls for that part to where, there were other parts leaking in, emotional parts and trauma parts and stuff. And it was making, what he had created me for somewhat, damaged or useless or whatever, which is why he did like after, twice I had gotten sent like specifically to his hotel room, other than at the party, that it was like, he like I had like a breakdown and he basically was like, like I'm not going to assign you anymore to Prawn. Prawn also didn't want me anymore because he had almost gotten caught in that instance because I was like screaming and stuff like that, and he's like in a fucking, he's not in an area that he should have like a screaming girl, you know what I mean? So, but then also Gates too was like, had this, kind of angry attitude where, he a lot of times he did when he felt people were like not respecting the boundaries he set, or, this idea that he was going to, break one of his favorite toys or something, because that was one of his favorite parts, that he felt was most modeled after him and his persona and stuff. So it's like, I would have been useless in that area of being exploited anymore, if like, he would have had to put a lot of effort into like reprogramming, a part like that. But
it doesn't, like, reprogramming an adult isn't going to work the same as programming a child, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, and this is when I was still a child, so I mean, they could have,
right, yeah.
they could have started reprogramming me. I think it was like maybe I was like 9 or so for the last event, essentially, that I had seen him, and so he could have, but ultimately for him, I think it was more, I don't know how to describe it. Like psychopaths are all about like the kid that doesn't want to share their toy and stuff like that, and like it's like he would get mad if like someone was crossing a boundary that he felt like he had set, and I think that's kind of like, it was kind of like an ego thing, a tiny bit
power
with him
thing,
too, yeah, exactly. So
you mentioned the control room. What is that?
Yeah, so that would be like the physical space. Like most like most systems are going to have some sort of like central channel, vertical channel that all of the rest of the worlds or the parts of the system, sections of the system are going to be built around, and it's kind of seen as like the air, the means of transportation when a part is getting triggered or called out, that that they have like a route that they feel like they're physically taking, and so there's, for me and a lot of survivors, it's like a central like elevator basically. Some people, have a tree of life, tree of death kind of situation. It would be like, going up the trunk towards like the crown versus down towards the roots, this kind of idea, but it's still like something that bridges all of these different parts and areas that are interconnected, but they all have to like join at some place. And that's also a lot of times why, typically you'll have your core centered somewhere along there as well, like your original self, however young it was prior to the abuse starting, essentially. Because that's like what does connect everything, what all of your parts were initially branched off of, essentially.
So the core splitting event, right? Is that what you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And they're usually going to, that earliest trauma is going to be the most impactful for a child. So they're usually going to, split and further split, from those initial, core splits or core split, singular. So a control room comes in a lot with manipulated dissociation, DDNOS, for two reasons. Is one is kind of what we just talked about, which is that it's like what's perceived as for the members of the system, the different alters. It's what is perceived as like the place closest to consciousness, essentially. It's what it's controlling is the body, essentially. So the behaviors, the speech, all of that stuff. It's not just existing mentally, it's also like there, to control the body, to control how the survivor is like moving through the world. And the control room, is essentially going to be a place where the parts are triggered and then brought in to that area, to be, essentially the ones that the abusers want. So like we just talked about with that last, thing, it's going to be like a team of specific alters. And this is going to be perceived as like the space that they're all occupying mentally, internally. But because they're essentially like queued up to be the different parts that can take control of the body, essentially. And with that comes the full consciousness and awareness of what's going on in the world around them and what they're doing. And then the other parts can have more of a blended consciousness, to where they are, interacting with each other and able to talk to each other, essentially. But the ones that aren't in the driver's seat are the ones that are less, able to enact, say anything or enact anything physically in the body, until even in the control room, you're going to have a hierarchy. Basically, you're going to have a main part that's there to direct the rest of the alter team, essentially, so that, they really ensure, that only the parts that are supposed to be out at the specific times are the ones that are out. So is that making sense so far?
Yeah, like a green room kind of, like waiting to go on stage with Johnny Carson, and then there's like these three acts in the back. They're like waiting, they're eating their carrots and dip, and getting ready to go on stage. Okay.
Yeah, and the experience would be, a lot of times for like the other parts that are not in control of the body, is either full awareness, like full blended consciousness with the main part, or it would be kind of what you see described as more like depersonalization or derealization. So like dissociative symptoms where those parts feel like they're watching a movie, or like, like the reality that they are kind of a part of but not able to enact their will in is like, it's like a play or a movie or something, that they're just witnessing outside of themselves, but they themselves have no control over, essentially. That would be derealization. Or depersonalization, this idea that, they feel like they're a witness, within their own mind of like the body, to where they recognize that it's a different personality that is talking, acting, doing all the things. And then a lot of times with that will come their own, thoughts and judgments about what is going on with the part that's in control of the body at the moment.
Wow.
And take a drink real quick.
Wow. So your consciousness is able to organize all of that as it's happening in real time. That's amazing. So in the control room, you can have other alters that are there just to receive input, like from the ears or whatever. Like the tape recorder can be in there just to do the recording, and like the cult loyal one who has to keep track and make sure all of them are in line. Like, I mean, that one can keep track from there. Maybe I mean, please explain.
Yeah. So the main one would essentially be like in control of like the parts switching in to take hold of the
loyal
body.
Is this one the cult loyal? Like Philomela in chart?
It's
okay.
Yeah. a gatekeeper alter, in the control room, like they're the highest of the hierarchy, and that's because they are, they're abuser identified. They feel like they are choosing to enact the will of the abuser and to play that role and everything. And a lot of times for them, it does feel like they feel like they are, or, like they're managing other people, like it's like if you're looking at a manager of a store or something, like they're not like, oh, like there's the same feeling, this idea that, yeah, we all know out here that they're all part of the same body, but the gatekeeper, the way they view themselves internally is they really have that much cognitive dissonance between and solidification of like their role as other than the parts that they're controlling, that it makes it really easy for them to be, the prison guard and, to really, be identified with like, the motivations that the abusers have given them. So there's no reason they would want to, do anything other than the role that they've been assigned, so they'll control, the switching into the control of the body, they'll still be overseeing it essentially, other people have called them like overseers or different stuff like that, and then they'll also be in control of like the elevator essentially. So kind of controlling the access to the control room because they know that there's all these other parts that are organized there, and they want to make sure that none of those other parts are allowed to be in there except for, the team that's been determined by the handler. But then sometimes when you do get older, especially, they're so programmed and so cult identified, they do allow those parts to make decisions as to like what parts switch in or out, basically, because that's the whole point of a lot of this training is like you're not always going to have a handler around, especially on longer assignments or something like that. So in that case, you want to make sure that you've got a really well-trained part on the inside that's internalized the needs of the abuser and the assignment or the mission or whatever, that you essentially are going to be, able to make those correct decisions the same as the handler would be making as to, okay, things have changed in this scenario a little bit. We actually need this other part, we need to abort whatever we're doing and we just need to bring in some stealth to like escape or something, that kind of thing, So, yeah, so, and that's like, that is those parts basically.
Okay,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Oh, well, I was going to say that I was going to go into the abuser identified alters and go into the, go further down there. But if you want to keep going control room, we can do that.
There's just one more thought that I had on it, so that's like the dual purpose, usually things serve a lot of different purposes in structures and systems and stuff like, but that's the other purpose in my experience is the point of the control room. And the reason why, basically OSDD or DDNOS are like characterized in two different ways. Either one, it's someone that has very few parts, like only one or two. A lot of times DDNOS and OSDD present as less DID than people that are diagnosed just DID, basically. Like when it's something that was allowed to happen organically, you'll experience like switches, and a lot of times it'll be a lot more obvious, I guess, the change in intonation, the change in mannerisms, a lot of different things, basically. So when you're dealing with OSDD or DDNOS, basically you have people at like one end of the spectrum of DID. Usually they present less DID because they are less DID. They have only a couple of different parts. It could be because the trauma was limited to a very short time of their life, of their developmental life, essentially, and then stopped. Maybe they were rescued from a situation and it didn't continue on. So they didn't continue, going through traumatic events that necessitated more and more trauma parts. So that's one end of it. And it also explains the other end where sometimes where people will have like a really large, an exponentially large number of parts because of the fact that the trauma, they went through so many trauma events, and that a lot of times they were, ritualized, they were repeated over and over, essentially. Now, a lot of times, and this is like where I fall, a lot of times when you're dealing with that, you can also present as less DID. And that is because of the control room, basically, is that you have a lot of times in your day to day life, so this is where the control room comes in, not to trauma events where they have the specific alter team, but this is where they have the control room, it still exists in the survivor's day-to-day life, essentially, going to school, interacting with friends, interacting with family members that aren't abusive, quote unquote, normal life. This is where this comes in, essentially, is that the abusers are aware that you're going to have all these triggers. They're aware that you're going to have all these different ways that you could be acting out in ways that would make it obvious to other people that there's something weird going on in this kid's life. If suddenly they know martial arts, or suddenly, they know another language, or suddenly, they're acting like a porn star. These are things, these are things that are really, or even if you're dealing with, normal PTSD symptoms like depression or anxiety, like things that would get the child survivor into a therapist's office, that maybe at school counselor's office, someone that isn't a controlled person in the child's life. They want to make sure that all of the switching that's going on, because they know it's inevitable that switching is going to be going on because the kid is so fucking DID, basically, like.
Right. And there's
and
other triggers in the world that are just happening, and your emotions
yeah,
are like,
they can't control all that.
Right.
So essentially what they need is they need the control room, and like essentially a lot of times like a chosen like front personality or mask personality that is there to essentially like smooth over all of the switching, all of the internal, like if a trigger is coming up and the emotionality is coming up, or something that's going to make the victim seem less functioning, or having some skill that they weren't supposed to, talking away they're not supposed to, like they use this part almost as like a filter to essentially, all of what's going on in, the control room, what's coming in and out and stuff throughout the day and getting triggered is essentially kind of smoothed over, so that you can essentially create like the look, many survivors are very high functioning, like
right.
really good at school, really good at having different talents and stuff. That's all part of like the chosen, like by the cult members, by the programmers. That's all part of like the chosen, like strengths and weaknesses and personality type that they want presented to the world, essentially. So it's like this cover, and it works as a cover, not just for the outside people, not just for people that are seeing this kid and being like, oh, they're so normal, they're so high functioning, they're so, a lot of times we still have a lot of tells throughout our childhood, but it's not enough for people to really, conceptualize what this kid is going through. But it also helps mask it for the child's day-to-day consciousness, because they don't want the victim themselves really realizing how multiple they are, essentially, because
Right.
that's when you start investigating and looking for healing or asking for help or something. So there's a lot of, with the gatekeepers, they employ a lot of parts that are there to gaslight you and to increase denial, or all these different things, in the day-to-day consciousness, so that, if you're getting triggered by a PTSD, trigger or something, and it's not, they don't want it to show, it's like there's a lot of, kind of gaslighting yourself to be like, I'm overreacting, I'm just over imaginative, a lot of these things that get you, these parts are taught to repeat to the front consciousness over and over, so that they perceive, that that
That's a
it's kind of
plausible
like talking
thing.
yourself down from the triggers, or negating them or invalidating them and just being like, I'm just crazy and I just need to, like, usually they'll give you something else to focus on. So for me, it was like goals or achievement or something. So if stuff starts coming up, then I would have a part, and for me, it was the same part, that was the head of a lot of times the switching in cult world and trauma world. They were also the one that was in control for the day-to-day consciousness, and was seen as like the bully, the slave driver in the system that would, really keep a hold on all this stuff, Um, so really, but really it's all there, like I said, to prevent the survivor themselves from internally investigating or presenting these different, personalities outwardly. I usually described it to my therapist as like, it felt like there was this funnel. Like I was trying, like early on in therapy, I was trying so hard to be able to like vocalize what was going on in my head. And I had this complete inability to, because I would be like, I know I can think it, but then it's like almost like there's like this like funnel that like, with a filter on it that almost like, all the information I'm trying to say. And it's like, it gets like, whittled down to like something that doesn't really make sense, or doesn't accurately describe what I'm trying to communicate, And I'm
Oh,
normally a very, like cohesive communicator, you know what I
right.
mean? But when I was in therapy, there was, it was an off limit situation. So you have these parts that are there to like, and you're so, ingrained in the masking of that stuff that it's like, it took a lot of working with finally getting the gatekeepers to start working with me to finally start being able to vocalize what I had been through, what was going on internally, and then, progress ensued from there.
Wow. Yeah, you told us in the last show that it's like making a child soldier lay down his arms, lay down his weapon, and like
Hmm.
realize it's not, World War II is not happening anymore. You can come out of the hole in the ground, whatever, these Japanese people on these like islands that are out in the 70s, like still thinking the war was still going. Um, anyway, like this, you had to convince them to work with you. And then once that happens, then it's like, then you have keys to the door, like they give you control instead of, and that's really the most beautiful, profound healing there that can be, is healing those gatekeepers, right?
I mean, gatekeepers in any parts that are part of the hierarchy, really, because they are the ones that are um, the most, have the most cognitive dissonance for your real personality. We're the most manipulated and the most traumatized and all of this stuff to like force them into those roles. So there's a lot of healing just, in dealing with PTSD symptoms and free, having free will and all that stuff from there. But it's also just the fact that, they do contain, when you're dealing with so much amnesia, if you're dealing with people like that, um, if you're dealing with especially like mind control victims, I mean, it's just like that for people that don't have manipulated dissociation, and they have a couple years of their life when they were getting abused that are just like essentially like completely blocked out, and any significant events that other people can remember, they just can't. And they're like, why? It's like something really significant. Like, how can I not? How can I not remember this? You know what I mean? And that's a lot of times the experience with like, incest survivors or not having memories around specific people in their life. It's like, I can remember all these other people in my life, but like my father, I have no memory of. And it's like, he lived in the house, like it's not normal to like have no memory of someone, unless they were actually absent. Um, but when you're dealing with the manipulated stuff, yeah, you have a lot of amnesia, a lot of questions, surrounding different things. And a lot of times you will also have like a lot of like cover memories where it kind of like goes into denial, where like you are used to like just like, if you're looking back on your life, almost just like it's like a quick glance, and you have just like this like same story, few sentences that you kind of like have been coached to like both repeat, but then also to like really like believe, like that, okay, I was part of a normal family and I never went through any trauma, and like everything was great. And because that also reinforces those gatekeeper part's ability to be like, if you have PTSD triggers coming up, be like, you're crazy, because when you look back on it, you just see this normal life. So it's like, this doesn't make any sense. I must be crazy, um, you having that argument in and of itself, part of yourself calling you crazy, and then other parts of you, belittling you or gaslighting you in different ways, like that in and of itself is a sign of DID. It's more than just self-talk of like the same voice that feels this way or that way. It's like, it's, literal parts of your mind that can't even begin to conceptualize how the other parts feel and are having this argument, essentially. So yeah, so I mean, it really goes into the amnesia side of things, that like a lot of survivors, once they start healing, have so many questions, like, okay, like how did I block this out for this long? How did I get from point A to point B? Like what is my life really? And until you work through a lot of this amnesic, stuff, because there was so much trauma that kept it amnesic. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the other gifts. It's just that you really don't know your own story until you know your own story, basically. And I mean, I don't know if people have had the experience of like blackout drinking, like I know it's not like super common for everyone, and some people it's more common than others, And I would argue people that are dissociative, it's like, it's super common, because we tend to have problems with addictions and our brain tends to automatically take that route, but the feeling of waking up, from anyone out there, like, even if it was just once that they partied and they woke up from a blackout, you know what I mean? Because they drank a little too much, or we're mixing things or something like that. And it's like that moment of like confusion, where am I? How did I get here? Like, why the fuck did I do that to myself last night?
And it is literal. It's abuse to the
I,
brain. Like your brain cells are like
yeah,
being abused. And I mean,
exactly.
yeah.
Like, and so that feeling is like, it's like that's the feeling around a survivor's whole life once they start in therapy. Is just like, once you're so used to looking forward and not looking back at all in your day-to-day consciousness, that once you do finally look back, it's just like, it's like that same feeling of waking up from black and be like, what the fuck happened last night? I need to start, piecing things together. And this idea, feeling of confusion, and just like, I don't even know, like, it's like you maybe a little bit of shame, a lot of different things, because, but
Yeah.
so that is a huge part, for me. That's one of the things I'm most grateful about, is to be at the point in my life where I don't have like big gaps and lots of questions and everything. Because I remember being on the other side of things where, once I started looking, I realized how much I didn't remember and how many things, it's like, especially once you start asking family members or something, that are supportive, and you're just like, how is it that I don't remember, any of these things, So a simple one for me was, in high school, I had a freaking hot air balloon land, like crash in the street in the neighborhood I was in the street in front of my
Wow.
house. Like literally a hot air balloon crashed in front of my house. And I was like a sophomore or junior in high school, like this is not like, oh, memories that I had when I was like, 4 or 5 that I can't remember. Like to a degree, that's normal. You know what I mean? Like having whole swatches of time though, or weird, like things like that. And like to have like people describing it to you in your life, and you're like, I was in my teens, there's no reason I should, it was
Yeah.
not that long, I mean, it
But
was
now
a
you
while.
know why the reason,
Oh yeah. Yeah,
right? And you created your show Desert Bikini to help your past self and other selves out there that are not yourself, but others that have a similar experience, that are fumbling in the dark. What did I do last night? What is my life like? Maybe they can realize that this thing that's happening is a common symptom of this experience mentally. They can learn from you. Can you please tell them about your show? Here, I'll share it. You have a YouTube channel, Desert Bikini. Please talk about
yeah,
that.
yeah. So I mean, this this channel really was, yeah, it was just born out of me trying to, I had subscribed to many channels that were like DID focused, both survivors and like therapist type stuff, learning, trying, a lot of times early on in your diagnosis, you're trying to learn about everything, because you're just trying to get your life to be like manageable, basically, you know, into a place where you can like function and, you know, be dealing with all of the really difficult things that got you into therapy and understanding about this stuff to begin with. Um, and, you know, I got a lot of benefit from what, you know, books I read, and then, you know, things that I had seen on like YouTube or other video platforms of people sharing their stuff, because it is very like validating and normalizing, and does give you more insight to, you know, understanding what's going on in your brain. But, you know, one thing that I felt like, you know, I didn't find and wanted, and so that's why I tried to create, was something that's almost more of like a, you know, it's like a gentle and like, you know, easy to understand like path to tackling, you know, understanding the dissociation, and then understanding how you move, how you actually create progress in your life, you know, because not everyone has access to a therapist. It's actually less common, you know, than most, you know. It's more likely that someone early in understanding this stuff has someone that isn't that versed in dissociation and stuff like that, mainly because there's just not a whole lot of them. That's changing, you know, a lot over like the past, you know, like 7, 8 years or so that I've been healing and everything. Like, it's becoming a lot more common for people to be trauma informed and understand about dissociation. But I mean, I still get, you know, comments from people now that are like, I went, you know, there was this one person, they said they went to graduate school, you know, and got their whatever in psychology, with specifically majoring in like understanding coercive control. And it was like, they didn't teach us anything about about, and it's like, dude, it's coercive control. They didn't teach you anything about like about how trauma played a role into people susceptible to this, or, you know, or
Wow.
dissociation as like the defense mechanism that's internalized and everything like that, you know. And
It's
it's
crazy
so,
though. I mean, you were trained like a dog, literally, and these
yeah,
people that are learning about psychology don't even know about it. I mean,
no, they're
Caesar
taught that
Milan can teach them, like,
rare.
you know, like what the fuck?
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, well,
Okay,
there's still
yeah.
this like narrative that like that mind control is some like weird Hollywood thing that isn't
Hmm.
possible or doesn't exist, you know, for
Right.
people that don't know much about it. And then there's also
Fantasy.
this, yeah, and
Yeah.
it's also perpetuated in people learning psychology that this is a rare condition, that DID, dissociation, amnesia is like childhood trauma is like rare. And like, yes, when you're looking at, you know, like the extent that I went through or my control victims went through, like, yeah, that is like in the grand scheme of the population, that is rare. You know what I mean? But degrees of DID is not rare at all, because many people have grown up, you know, even, you know, with a parent that's addicted, you know, is dealing with addiction, you know, and that is like a form of, you know, unpredictability and, you know, trauma like that they had to deal with, you know, their caregiver being drunk versus not drunk, you know, and interacting with two different kinds of people, you know. So that's not a rare thing at all, you know, but
No.
it's a, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Especially
But
with the
so it's like,
alcoholism and the incest
mm-hmm,
and all the pornography. I mean, I'm sure this
yeah,
world is awash with that type of.
yeah, and that's why it's like, I think it's better characterized as a spectrum, just like most mental health things, is like depending on what the person went through depends on how much dissociation they might have of events from the past. But it's definitely not rare. That I would say it's more common than not to at least have some things that, you know, people tend to like, you know, block out, especially if they're dealing with just, you know, child abuse or incest or, you know, different things. Like, it the evidence, you know, the statistics show that is common.
Right.
So a child
It should be
reacting,
taught. Like, what the? Please, I'm sorry. It is
yeah,
common,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
that's why it's like my channel really was about, you know, it's about to shift into my second series, which is just focusing on, you know, doing the persecutor parts and the gatekeeper parts is kind of like my transition into, you know, because I've talked a lot in those past few about manipulated dissociation, but the bulk of my channel ahead of that, was really trying to be dissociation in general. And I also talked about, manipulate dissociation, but it wasn't like it's because it's based off of natural dissociation. This has been the whole first part of my channel. These like first 10 videos or something have just been about understanding DID, no matter where you fall on the spectrum of it, just understanding how it works and everything. So what we're talking about in this last episode with you and, this episode and like the next videos that I'm going to be putting out after finishing up a couple more additions to the Persecutor parts that I've been talking about, is going to be just focusing on ritual abuse and mind control, because it's it in and of itself, by the nature of it, is going to get more triggering. And my channel up until this point has really been focused on, all of my, self-help workbooky, meditation exercises, journal exercises, just basic understanding of stuff has really been geared towards child parts and the initial, the person that's just getting into this, so that things can be presented in a way that's like simple, easy to understand, something that a kid, hopefully, or an outsider could understand, and in a way to conceptualize and normalize it, and hasn't been like super triggering, not like my testimonies I've done like here and elsewhere. But yeah, that's where we're moving next, is going into just the manipulated dissociation, just kind of deprogramming, just really understanding mind control, which not everyone is going to have, essentially, but the initial ones I wanted to be able to be a little bit more all-inclusive, I guess.
Right. It kind of eases it in too. It kind of tempers the mind, so you're not like blasting them with boiling water all of a sudden. You're like warming it up slowly.
And those are the basic concepts that someone like me would need to start with to be able to understand the later stuff. So you need that context. You need that context of just how dissociation works, just in everyday scenarios, before we can get into like kind of like that on steroids.
Right. And that's what you know best from your life, so that's what you're going to speak. And some people, they can't take like the shows that you've done with the imagination, Emma. Some of those like are very graphic. Trigger warning, people like all that. But that's necessary, for you to say it, to get, and for others to understand it, for your own healing, but this, it's, there's some people are gonna get it, and those people really need it. This is the kind of thing that you don't want to like. You're not trying to be Joe Rogan's podcast. Like, you're trying to get like those that need you, and really understand and will listen, that care, So like, I've got this book from Kurth Barker, and like even the title is like, it's Blood Drinking, Cannibalism, and High Adept Satanism. Of course, I'm going to pick that one up first because I want to know the real, But other people are like, whoop, like I lent that to a friend and it's gone. It sucks, man. But I love her, so whatever. It's okay. She's a good friend. I'm not going to get mad, but still, like that kind of book is for certain people, and those people need to hear the nitty gritty, because then it might click something in their head, and they are trying to figure out their own brain, So I'm glad that you're going to go into the specific scientific, Monarch mind control, because that's very important for us to learn.
Thank you. And that's kind of what I hope, is that I I just see that I'm like paying it forward the same as like I've gotten from other survivors that like when it comes to my testimony, yes, like that you know, I'm pretty open talking about like what I do and like the advocacy work and stuff like that. And when people are like, "Oh, like let me hear your interviews," it's like I'm always like,
Yeah.
like like only like I always tell them I don't expect you to. Like I was like it's very dark stuff, and like huge trigger warning. Even for if you're a survivor that's gone through it, huge trigger warning, and if you're not, same goes, because there's a level of secondhand trauma that you can experience if you're like, really, just reading and learning about, pedophilia, from a more detailed, understanding of it, of like, how trafficking networks work or how training goes into, these kids or different stuff. It's like, um, it can be secondhand traumatizing, and it's like the type of thing where I only want people to learn, like you're saying. It's like if they're want to look at, people talk about doing shadow work with looking at the dark side of yourself. Well, this is like looking at the dark side of humanity, and it's like
Yeah.
really, really want to see the depths of like crazy fucking humanity, like be prepared, because it's gonna be way worse than you ever imagined,
Yeah.
because you're a normal person that is, could never even conceptualize what a psychopath is not only capable of, but is like motivated by and turned on by, and just like it's disgusting and mind blowing, but to me it's like it's necessary, because if someone is like or other allies, willing to like, I'm tired of people pussyfooting around and just, being vague about, this or that. Like I want to understand like what's really going on and really going into this, like then it's like that's who it's for, and the same for survivors is like, many survivors are looking for answers. And when you're early on in healing, my interviews are probably not like the best, like because they are very graphic and detailed. And if you're early on in healing and you're still dealing with like a lot of denial parts or stuff, then hearing such graphic detail from any survivor can actually, increase the denial and stuff like that. Because even if
because you don't want it to be true.
Exactly. And your subconscious self too, like, it doesn't want to be known, and you may have all these triggers that are indicating that this is where, like similar abuse that you yourself have gone through. But if you haven't, been able to work through the incest and the different things like that yet, then what it's going to do for those, talking about the control room, the denial parts and the gatekeeper parts, is it's just going to give them like fuel for asserting that you're crazy or over imaginative, because they'll be like, you're coming up with something that you heard, on this podcast over here, and you're really like, it didn't really happen
that
to you.
whole
You
satanic panic. Oh, it's not real. They just told you it's real, and
that's what's happening internally. So for me, like the most graphic survivor testimonies and stuff were the most validating, but that's because I had already dealt with, a lot of, journaling, a lot of dealing with these parts, a lot of really addressing all of this, and still felt crazy because I was like, where the fuck could, it's like,
especially with the
don't want
dog
to believe it's
stuff.
true.
Like you're telling me, like when your dogs are fighting, and then all of a sudden, like in your mind, like why would that be there? Like holy crap.
Just like, yeah, it's like it's yeah, especially when you're encountering parts like that, that we're in an extreme situation and was expected to be buried by your handlers for a long time, and it comes out because of life circumstances, and it's suddenly you're dealing with parts of your psyche that you never knew you had, and like,
Right.
and that's the whole process. So for me, it's like it was very much that, like, it wasn't until I really was able to like journal, watercolor, write about, have a good idea of all these parts. And I'm still feeling crazy, essentially, still dealing with the denial part that's being like, despite the photographic recall, despite, all of the emotions, all the triggers that I know are the reality. It's like you still have part of you that is holding on to that role of being like, nope, like, this is bullshit. This kind of stuff doesn't happen. You know what I mean? And then at that point, was when I started really listening to like the imagination, for example, and starting to like, seek out people that were saying that they had stories similar to everything that had come up for me in therapy and journaling and healing and everything. And in that instance, total validation, because I felt like I was crazy talking about being kept in a kennel or like a wire cage, or that, I was a child being, gang raped and filmed, or I was, a kid that was being trained to perpetuate violence on innocence, and stuff like that. And then I can listen to people that I have never heard before, have know nothing about, and person after person after person that's giving the same experiences, just different, slightly different scenarios, or specifics, but it's still roughly the same thing. So it takes, that denial part and just like shoves it all in their face and be like, bro, like
Right.
this is something that happens, this is literally something that happens, like it's not, I'm not unique because of it, and that, I don't know.
Episode that Emma had you and Nathan Reynolds and Gray, the three of you together, and like all three totally different, but you're like the same. It was so weird. And like Gray with his wolf stuff and you with your wolf stuff, and it's like
it's a common trope in like the kind of assassin military programming. Like that's something I've come to find, and it's like it's so identical in its both roles in our system, but the way it was trained and all of this stuff, that it just becomes very like, okay, like, we've never met each other, there's no way that you're intentionally like making this stuff up and then it's being so like identical, like unless there's a playbook that's being followed essentially with all of these different kids, And
so that also proves the satanic panic wrong, all that shit. Like it proves that that's all false. Okay, please.
Oh yeah. No, I mean it's funny. Yeah, well, kind of. So I mean it's funny that you say that, just because like one of the videos that we have on my YouTube, how it gives you like that little like infographic or like little blurb a lot of times at the top, like disinformation type of thing. Like it'll give you like a Wikipedia, like little Wikipedia page that's like, oh, like whatever. And one of our videos, one of our last ones, had that at the top of it. Like when I visit my own page, and it said like satanic, Wikipedia, satanic panic, and it's funny because satanic wasn't anywhere in like the title of the episode or anything. And it's not on all of them, but on this one it was. But what it said was that it was defining the satanic panic as, starting in the 1980s and spreading into the 1990s, over 12,000 unsubstantiated cases of ritual abuse. And I was like, it's putting this on my page to make it seem like bullshit because it's like unsubstantiated cases, but 12,000?
That's a lot.
That's so many more than I even pictured had come out. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I was like, how do you have 12,000 people?
Wow. And that's only in the space of the 80s to the 90s. Shit. Like, look at now. Like,
that's what I'm saying. It was like, to me, it was like mind blown. I was like, well, this is both.
So it's like proving it. It's trying to debunk you, but it's proving it in itself.
Yeah, to a logical person, you would read that and be like, how is it that there were, 12,000 people that are having, that are all going through this mass hysteria and but somehow able to like recollect all like the same scenarios and shit. It was just wild, just wild to me. Basically.
It's funny that like the algorithms are like programmed to fight, for the Satanist point of view, and like it's so like it's like it's like a paper tiger. You blow them in the wind, like they got these AI like videos and people got like 6 fingers and they get the guns have like barrels going in both directions. Like the computers it's retarded. They don't understand. It's the logic. We can look at those numbers, 12,000 unsubstantiated. Okay, how do you substantiate it? Like, and what's the parameters and who substantiates? Like,
Exactly. And it's funny because it's literally the same way that, in my understanding, like my experience, that abusers think, and function.
Mm.
They're so convinced of their superiority. You know what I mean? Like, this is part of like why everyone, like even normies, can like watch like concerts nowadays or music videos and be like, why is everything so satanic? Like, why am I seeing the same ritual over and over? And these are people that don't even want to care about this shit,
No.
but it's become so repetitive that it's like hard not to notice it. If you're just a
Yeah.
regular, everyday, rational
Yeah,
human
and
being.
now they're going after the country too. Even like Beyonce's bringing her Satanism right in. Like all countries dying now too.
Yeah,
Like that was the one bastion of like everybody's like, I hate country. Oh,
yeah.
I hate country for years, forever. And now like even that is like being fucking
Hmm.
satanified.
Yeah, it's true. I mean,
Oh
there's like a
man.
Shakespearean quote too, which is like what it makes me think of, where it's like, "Thou dost protest too much," that it's like someone's like being like, "No, no," like too like
Mm,
defending, being too defensive, it automatically makes them seem like guilty, and like that's been
red
even the
flag.
experience. Yeah, it's been
Yeah.
even the experience in my life, is like when my abusers are like, interacting with people that know me, essentially, have a relationship with me in my life, coworkers or other, family members, like cousins my age or friends or stuff. And, they go to my ex boss, one of them who like knows what's up and is best friends with my uncle who abused me. And he's just like, oh, did you hear the crazy shit Carrie's talking about, and like,
And
and
they're
then the
not
guy
trying to think
says,
about that, but he's
well,
bringing it up to them, right?
that's what I'm saying. It's like they feel like they're so like intelligent. Everyone else is so stupid that they're gonna do what abusers always do, which is just make us, the victim, seem crazy. They're gonna say, oh, she's after attention. She's got a screw loose for XYZ reason. All this stuff. But they're talking to people that like know me and have worked with me and are just like, but
I
it
love
sounds
you.
like if she's saying that, yeah, it sounds like if she's saying that, like it's probably true, and why are you even
Right.
bringing it up right now, you fucking weirdo,
Yeah.
because it's like they know me from my life. They know that I'm not a dramatic person and that I'm like, uh, have positive relationships with people, and all this stuff. And then the people that I'm calling out, they know are, alcoholics and have done all this other shady shit, and stuff. And it's like, so you're trying to be like, I'm the crazy one. But then people that know me are like, well, she seems pretty like rational. Like,
Right.
mostly like, why? Like, I don't like, we've never seen this kind of this crazy behavior that you're implying, like that is
Right.
like, that's never been a thing. So yeah, it's just
So I
interesting.
mean, they can't. Their cognitive dissonance and their fucking lie. They can't. It doesn't. Like truth is there, and like when
Yeah, they
people
just think we're
use
all too stupid to see it.
right, right, and they're too confident in their you know their
Narcissism,
ego makes it like
megalomania.
yes, yeah, well said, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what they all have. Whether you're dealing with a sociopath, a psychopath, malignant narcissist, all these people, they're so convinced of their power and superiority that they're like, convinced that any person they talk to is going to be fall under their, sway and be manipulated by
Hmm.
them. It's like, bro, you're not talking to like a traumatized 5-year old. You're talking to like another adult, and he like they can see
But I'm
right through
riding
it.
a horse and wearing tights. Okay, dude. Okay. Yeah. So okay. So this that also lent their ego and their megalomania like that lends itself to the controlling of the control room because you have internal alters that are gatekeepers that take the form of the abuser, right?
Have the same
So
mentality. So that same mentality, this idea of superiority, this internally, mentally, physically superior to the other parts that they're dealing with,
mm.
managing and gatekeeping and stuff.
So I kind of wanted to. I mean, so they share the will and the drive of the abuser. Um, there's also the phenomenon of demonization,
Hmm.
where the will and the drive of a demon is implanted into the victim. Can you talk about that some, please?
We talked a little bit about, like, there's two different, takes someone could have on this.
Right. Yeah.
Essentially that, through ritual abuse, it's essentially not just the trauma, but a big play that's being put on for the child part to really convince them of something. So you could see it as two different things. You could see it as that, the child has been, told during the trauma event, what the archetype this demon might embody is, what the physical characteristics are, like what their likes and dislikes are, all of this different stuff, and they feel like, they're put through. So we're dealing with a child, it's dissociating. They're going to be highly susceptible to suggestion and everything as like this trauma part is split off, So whatever the abusers, the things around them tell them the world is, that's what the world is. They don't have anything to disprove it, outside of the current event, the trauma event that they're in. So you can have essentially like a kid that's convinced to play a certain role, that they're being taken over by this demon, and it's getting implanted in them in some way, either through rape or some sort of torture or some other ritualized, acts being performed on the child, or the child being forced to perform themselves. They can essentially be convinced that they've become, opened up some sort of gateway, either externally or within themselves, that's letting this outside entity in. And then from then on, that child's going to have a trauma part that essentially has that identity within the system and continues to behave and self-conceptualize, and perform whatever roles in the system, or when they're called out, out of the system, especially like violence or stuff that they're convinced of. A lot of times it would be important for anything like violent, both to for the act of like dehumanization, so making them feel like they're not human, and it's easier to perpetrate on humans if they feel like they're something that's other than human and superior, etc. Or it's like if you're dealing with violent situations like like assassination and like murder type stuff, it could also be like we had talked about earlier, the idea that the battle's won before it's fought, based off of the mindset, so it's just the
So if you believe you have a demon helping you kill this person, then you will achieve better.
People are shown to have like a mom getting super strength to save her kid, like that. That actually does happen. That does actually exist, where it's like there's this level of belief, and sometimes people can perform somewhat like what would be seen to most people in a normal day-to-day event, like a totally superhuman task, and it's something that can just come from complete focus, some training, and and a complete belief, essentially. So that's a lot of like why you would want it to create demon parts in a kid, is like if they're convinced that they can't feel pain. And I mean, you see a lot of movies that have the trope of like I'm trying to think, like Mad Max and just like a bunch of them, where it's like almost like they take this drug and suddenly they believe they're invincible. So that means that even if they get shot or hurt or stabbed, like they're convinced that they're not going to die. So they'll just push through, and continue to enact whatever violence they can until their body literally gives out on them. Because mentally they're not connecting with what's going on. Eventually, they'll succumb to their wounds, but they continue to freaking fight like a berserker because they're convinced that they're not going to die. So
like it could be a convinced. They are convinced that they are demon riding, demonization, not demon possession. But then it could be demonization.
But then it could also yeah. And so this is like where my understanding goes with it, is that like in reality, if we look at the evidence through all of human history, like pretty much every culture seems to have some idea that there are negative entities, negative forces that are outside human will, that it's like it's an outside entity, that yes, people are evil, but there are also spirits that are evil, or things, how I understand it, existing on a different plane, maybe a lower vibrational plane than what we're on. And people could say, like, you talk about like egregores, things that are like thoughts given form because so many people have done it. That's a lot of what I think does go into the ritual abuse, and repeating these same ceremonies year after year, with the exact same thing, is that, it's an outside entity that is like reinforced by the same lower vibrational shit over and over.
Mm-hmm.
The opposite is also true. We have a lot of like positive rituals that exist in like people's lives, shamanic type stuff that, is kind of tapping into kind of positive forces that want to help in the world if you just ask. It's the same for what I see with negative entities, is like they're just waiting for the intentional consent to like open that door, basically.
Right.
And that's where I see demonization on a literal, on like a literal, spectrum, would be that you're traumatizing a kid enough to where they are willing to ask for help from an outside entity and are getting an actual response back, essentially, and they're often going to be asking, for whatever the abusers have told them is going to potentially help them, so they'll be presented with these demons as something that's going to save them or end the pain or have them feel, powerful and less vulnerable. So it is possible too for like there to be, actual demonization. I think most of the time that it occurs though is from my understanding, like actual, like individuals that have gone fully to like the dark side, essentially, and are almost more essentially like skin suits, that like there's a degree of the wounded kid in them, but it's like it's been so cut off and suppressed and everything, and it's almost like all of their system has like identified with just making this
non-human
opening themselves up to this, because they've understood this is a form of power and survival, and they've really just chosen to make themselves, to bargain away their soul and make themselves like a vessel, basically, and I think most of the time we were dealing with survivors that are DID. Like I'm, just gonna hazard, that we're dealing with like more like 90% of people are dealing with the convincing side of things, that people aren't actually, demonized, that they, they're convinced of it. And if they are, so
those people convinced have kids and convince their kids and have kids and convince their, so like maybe that, but
it's
please.
part of it, I think both exist, generational demonization and generational abuse, to where, it's the convincing side of things. But even those survivors that, may actually have had, chosen to open up some sort of doorway, been convinced as a kid that it's, it's not easy, but it's simple, but it's just the simple act of like, revoking, getting in touch with that part and getting that part to like revoke consent, and that's, whether you're dealing with, spiritual understanding of any sort of faith, that's a lot of times what gets a survivor through, but they, they're choosing to bring their system along, all parts of the system, including the most lost ones, the demonized parts, to, to essentially say, hey, no, I'm not interested in being evil or doing any of that stuff that you want me to do anymore, and it takes a lot. It's simple, but it takes a lot to really convince those parts that they are safe and able to like, move into the place they've always wanted to be, which is in the light as opposed to in the dark. It's just like working with persecutors or gatekeeper parts. It's like where you get the most healing, really, in those parts, essentially. So that's a big part of it. But when it comes to like the skin suit type people. Like
Right, like
that's where,
Les Wexner or whatever. He has a debut, right? And he like in the
yeah,
interview, he talks about he's proud of this demon that he has, right? That helps him
yeah,
live. And
yeah.
he's the guy that runs Jeffrey Epstein, and like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So I would put like my handler, in this category. I
mm,
would put like my father,
yeah,
in this category. Where that to me this is almost like the definition, like the spiritual definition of a psychopath or sociopath. That I do believe that my father was not necessarily thoroughly sexually abused himself, but he was put in the position of a young age, which is still trauma. He was put in the position of a young age of being forced to witness his siblings be abused and to do nothing about it or encouraged to participate. And so some kids would wall that stuff off and try and keep a part of themselves, like essentially, you know, um, like whole or like still fighting for the good. And I think others, they really just they kind of their own accord early on choose the side of the abuser, because they've been forced into this position of being like, I'm either the one that gets hurt or I'm the one that does the hurting. And and then through their, as they get older and through their adolescence and adulthood, they essentially choose to you know reinforce that belief with their behaviors by consistently choosing to abuse others and to take advantage of others and stuff. And it's kind of further solidifying their
it's a stepwise
consent
progression
for,
into the consent.
yeah, to the point where once they're old enough to consciously know, and they're still choosing to like offend on small children or stuff like that, and then they're from their adolescence they're in their adulthood, and
Right,
there's kind of they've kind of reached this point of no return,
right.
essentially, to where they at that point are like, they've made the decision of self-service over service to other, like, so
Mm.
many times it really has completely solidified,
That's
their,
this.
yeah.
Sorry, I'm
No,
sorry.
no, you're fine.
That's the same stepwise progression that John Euler teaches us about with psychopathy and pornography,
Yeah.
and how you
Yeah.
can tell how far a psychopath is by what kind of pornography they're into.
Mm-hmm.
And your father is had the worst kind of pornography. The
Yes.
so
Yeah, that was
uh,
the thing that got him off the most, was watching an innocent person be like maimed or killed, essentially, like during the act. Like, it's like
yeah, the
pretty, yeah, it was,
worst. And
yeah,
then he would be abusing you at the same time as he's watching this. Like it's
yeah,
like, and then you're being like split and traumatized, and so like of course Gates is like, oh, we'll hire you. What are you doing over there? Come with us. We got a whole situation.
yeah,
Uh,
exactly. They psychopaths love other psychopaths because they know exactly
mm.
how, like, to manipulate them and have
And
power
it
over them. Give them
validates their
what they want.
ego. Like, oh yes, it is a good thing. See, they're doing it too. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is the act of becoming evil, is choosing to continue to double down on turning away from God or goodness or whatever you want to say, and choosing
Yes.
instead to, it's really kind of like throwing all your eggs into the evil basket, because
Right.
at that point you realize that, if there was this like God based on justice, or karma that was based off of like positive versus negative karma, you're so fucked that
Mm.
you're essentially, it's, and because they're self-serving and they're very kind of almost like logical and unemotional about stuff, they're like, well, obviously I'm going to hedge my bets and just like worship the evil God that is essentially
Mm.
cool and encouraging all the things that I want to do anyway. It means I don't have to
Lucifer, he
choose.
brings light.
Yeah.
I love it. He's great.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, totally. And I think that where me and John Uller probably split off is that, he often says that, from, because he's someone I followed a bunch on, your podcast and Emma's podcast and stuff, and his own podcast, because I have gotten a lot of insight from him. But
Right.
the one area that I think that I disagree with him is that he asserts that, that psychopaths, a lot of psychopaths were never abused, and that this is just like an excuse that they tell to like rationalize like
Oh,
how fucked up
well,
they are when they get caught. But
yeah.
ultimately, I'm like, to me, it's like, even if my dad wasn't physically abused himself, being brought up by an abuser,
There's
a
something
psychopath,
there. There's some kind
was
of
that is emotional neglect and abuse in and of itself,
right.
to a
But he
developing
worked
child.
in the system. Like, like I'm a cannabis smoker. Like I've been through jail and parole and all that crap. And like parole officers see everybody like, you're a piece of shit. You're a piece of shit. I don't care about you. You're a piece of, and just
Mm-hmm.
like when they've seen it all and they, there's just such an overwhelming amount of like pieces of shit they get. I'm sure he's a little bit jaded,
Oh yeah, yeah.
from seeing it so much. And then they talk to him about, and he talks about how like they're reading spy novel, or not spy novels, but like detective novels, or like these, I forget what it was, but basically women are getting abused in these books, and like they're reading it openly and they're like smiling like I get to do
Yeah.
this in jail. Like they're still giving him an fu, like, so he doesn't. I don't know. I give him the benefit.
No, I
I
mean,
mean, he and I
I don't know.
disagree on other things, like, but we, I'm not going to talk
Circumcision.
about that. Yeah. I wasn't going to bring it up, but he's, I
I
wanted to
also
bring him on the show
on
to talk
that.
about that.
So
I wanted to talk about the psychology of circumcision and what it does, and how it relates to, and he disagrees religiously. You know, so I'm like, okay, I understand, and we talk about these other things instead. And at least he was upfront with me and said
yeah,
what he,
I
So
mean,
like
we're not always going to see eye to eye with everyone on everything, So it's
right,
just
right. Everybody
yeah,
has different levels. Like like being an anarchist, like I'll like say something to a statist out there, and then like it just hits them wrong, and I'm like, oh shit. Like it's because they got levels of, I understand that statism is a control system, just like I understand that religion is a control system, and like it's managing people, and um, like really this SRA is like understanding that too. It's like,
hmm
there's levels. So like circumcision is one part of a vast array of spectrum of abuse that's done to society, um, so yeah,
yeah,
some people like whatever. We don't need to get into that. But so okay, so the demons, the people can, like Les Wexner will take on the will and the drive of this. Not also what you were saying before is these people get lost, and like they're too far gone,
yeah.
right? Like Les Wexner, he's proud.
hmm
Um,
I think that the only time that like you'll see the abused child that they once were is like when things are like they're like under threat and things are like really not going their way, like maybe they're getting found out or
mm,
something. Like it's like that I've seen that with, my dad. I've seen that with like Gates and stuff like that. And it's like, it's as soon as they realize they're not all powerful, like you'll see this like like the like 180, and this is why it does almost feel like a, almost like a somewhat DID kind of thing, but not really, because they really just have this, like one or two parts that are genuinely identified with the kid, but they're like they've been rejected for so long, and for most of their childhood lives and adolescent lives, they're so super buried. This is really what someone who's psychopathic is running away from the most, is the feeling of powerlessness. So as soon
mm,
as they are put in a position where they feel powerless, it's like you will see this like bleed through, like when my dad was starting to get called out by like myself and one of my cousins, it's like he like had this like total like break for a little bit, where he was like curled up in a fetal position and sobbing like a little baby, like in front of his girlfriend and like my cousin and stuff like
good.
that. And it's like, it's like, then that's part of why I say, like, yeah, like in prison, sometimes psychopaths do fucking kill themselves, For one, it's like, kind of like, I think the demon's like ultimate like fuck you to be like, I have control, and like
Right.
like they would rather just like almost like the psychopath hierarchy works in general. If someone gets caught or is like outed, it's easier just to off them, you know what I mean, than allow the investigation and stuff
Right.
like that. So, but it's also like, them literally, like, I think it's what the demon parts want, but it's also like their ultimate feeling that, that it's like their worst nightmares to have, people see them as like disgusting pieces of shit, so they'd rather just like, no, this is what I spent my whole life running away from. I spent my whole life being, the powerful person, the respected person, the whatever, that it's like the thought that they're going to be seen by other people for what they actually are. I think for a lot of them is too much, and they do, it is easy to revert into that, powerless and just like, I'm just out. They can't even like conceptualize or handle the thought of being in that position again that they've been running from their whole lives, basically.
So they'll like fight like a cat in a corner type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Or choose to, to have the ultimate control and to actually take themselves out. Like Epstein obviously was suicided. You know what I mean?
Suicided. Right,
yeah, suicided. And
right.
many abusers that were part of the network and then got caught also went through the same thing. It's like an attempt to like hush everything up. But
Right.
also there are many instances, I believe, not every pedophile that gets caught is being taken out by some giant system. Sometimes they literally are taking themselves out because they can't psychologically handle, living with people seeing them for what they are, and the thing that they've been trying to hide from general society for so long, except for their buddies that, are cool with it, basically, and see him as the big, powerful man because they're also abusing kids, So yeah, it
So
is.
that brings us to the next thing, though. If they are so far gone, they won't be allowed a body the next time. So their spirit is non-corporeal and stuck here because it can't move on. Maybe demons are psychopaths that are still here and they can't get a new body and grow out of being a psychopath. They're just, are, I mean, who knows?
I mean, I guess that's my, like, kind of how I see it tends to be like, it depends on I mean, it's hard to know exactly how karma works, basically, and
Yeah, of
how
course.
because sometimes I think that is part of like the quote unquote selling their soul is that, that they, and how bloodline stuff works in like, satanic families and everything like that, is that, part of them selling their soul is that this idea that they are going to be able to reincarnate in the same bloodline, etc. That almost like that there's this negative force of incarnation, and I think that's a lot of times why those kids do make that decision, or like whereas other kids, are able to dissociate and save part of themselves. I think how my understanding of it is it's like a chain of consciousness is like why a kid is like able to give up their innocence that easily is because maybe they came in with the intention that they were going to do the same thing all over again. And I wouldn't give like every Joe Schmo, pedophile out there, the idea that they have like enough quote unquote power. But that's where I think we start getting into understanding, whether we're talking about actual entities and like that there's a hierarchy there and different degrees of power depending on like which parts of the hierarchy you're really dealing with, and it's hard to know, I mean, I don't know if I've gone over my it's like my most like woo woo stuff I talk about, but about like my understanding of like where I was at before I was incarnated in this life, basically. Have I ever talked about that on the
No,
show?
not on this show. And please talk about it here.
So, yeah, I've talked about it a few times, and I did recently on like Max Lowen's podcast. I think I've talked about it on like Emma's podcast
She's
before.
fantastic. We love Max Lowen.
Yeah, I just did my second part with her. She's wonderful. It's like the first time I've been on a Survivors podcast, and it's just so like it's such a unique experience to be talking to someone so like well adjusted and stuff that like isn't an ally. It was just has actually gone through it. It's like a different level of like, not needing to explain things, really, like, and just, so
she can
it's
instantly give compassion for you because she totally understands it already.
yeah, she's gone through very similar shit, like just all the same shit, different flavor, but yeah, it's forced perpetration and all that stuff, so
Yeah.
so basically, like when
Before you were
we
born, tell us about that.
yeah, so I don't talk about this a lot except for in places that I feel really safe, but um just because feels like the most like woo woo part of my story. The thing that would be the hardest for just the general public to believe, I guess, because people, like we were just talking about, have different beliefs when it comes to their religious or spiritual estimation of how the world is and how it works and stuff like that. So if you're someone that doesn't believe in reincarnation, then everything I'm going to say is going to sound crazy. And that means that, why a lot of times I don't share it and I just stick to kind of like the more nuts and bolts, like physical experiences I've had, is because to me, I care way more about that side of things getting exposed and making a difference moving forward in the future for people, like really understanding how trafficking and the overall pedophile, psychopath
Because we need to stop it.
works.
I mean, it needs to
Exactly.
like, justice.
And I'm very self-conscious about like, saying things that go into the more, or like the channeling stuff, for example, like that kind of things that I've gone through, which is my own form of what you would say demonization, this idea of entity attachment and being a vessel for
Artemis and Diana, right? That you had three, Hecate, Artemis, and Diana, right?
Yeah.
So they were like kind of a demonization too. Like you were given their drives and their will, and like it was implanted in you. I'm sorry.
It was mainly just like it's like an archetypal force. It's like it in my system, like there were parts that were branched off of that initial entity attachment. But it all came back to the same archetype of, sexuality and violence, like the dark side of womanhood, and the entity, goddess,
Mystery
whatever you want to call
Babylon, like
that. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Many names throughout the ages, but it's the same basic, like force or power or outside
temple prostitution, like that whole
exactly. So
priestesses of Inanna,
and the channeling stuff for me is like that's why I just like we talked about the demonization. It's like I go back and forth about being like it could be them just forcing a kid into so much trauma that they are able to split off apart. Many survivors talk about psi abilities. Like for me, maybe, and other channelers, they just force out a part that has an out of body connection to like the Akashic records or the worldwide consciousness, or whatever you want to call it. So that could be where I'm getting answers to the questions that I should not know, or like I said, like also it could be that, that I did consent at a young age through this ritual process to be a vessel for this outside entity. I'm still honest that like I don't have 100%, understand one way or another. I lean towards the second one, mainly because of the nature of those memories being very different than all of the other stuff I've dealt with. But yeah, it's just another thing though that is like a consent thing. So it's like something that was like, is like you can choose not to, to heal to the point where you're not putting yourself in a position where you're consenting to that entity to come through you. Once I was basically like, I'm stopping doing the rituals. I'm not going to do any of this stuff anymore. I'm either going to kill myself, or I'm just going to find a way to heal, but it's like, that, at that point consent is revoked, so it's,
and that can always happen. You can always revoke consent. Like there's no hopelessness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And I think that will probably be the last thing that I share, and we can talk about it a little bit too, but mainly just because like I have allergies right now and my voice is starting to get a little weird.
Okay.
I was gonna say, so yeah, so basically, um, there's a survivor, Svali, which I know you know about. She helped me a lot in my healing through this site that I would encourage anyone that's interested in this stuff to go to. It's called Deprogram Wiki, and it's got like Fritz Springmeier's book on it, but then also his, a lot of other articles. Unknown Ozian is another one. A lot of different contributors that are either survivors or people that work with survivors, and it's really like one of the best like nuts and bolts resources for understanding deprogramming in general, basically. So it's something I encourage anyone. It's just like a wealth of information. It's got a lot of different things put on there. Svali is a survivor. She's also early, like Kathy O'Brien, in like talking about this abuse and how to heal from it and everything. So a lot of her stuff has been very helpful to me, the written stuff on there. But she's been on the Imagination podcast a few times as well. And, I was kind of in like the darkest point of my own healing where I was starting to really wrap my head around all of the forced perpetration and the butcher stuff and just like all of the really dark things that I had witnessed and had to be a part of, and everything. And, I had dealt with a lot of, anger at myself for being able to be, manipulated, even though I was a kid, into doing these things. But then there was also like a lot of like, just like heart wrenching, like anger towards God, towards the universe, for this stuff to even be like possible. You know what I mean? For it to even like be something that can exist, this level of like darkness. And I remember I was like listening to Emma episode that was about Savali, and I'll try and paraphrase it, here. But she was talking about a dream that she had when she was in the same position in her life, where she was so overwhelmed by the, dealing with the amnesia. It was great, but then you get to this point where you're so overwhelmed by the amount of darkness that you went through. It's just like you have this overwhelming, almost like, anger and just, kind of like nihilistic, like what's the point, and just depression and everything like that. And, and this feeling like that you yourself are like irredeemable, like that in just as a person, because you've participated in all of these things. And she essentially had this dream, where she felt like it had brought her out of that place, where she had this dream that she was in like this like purgatory room, and it was her and a bunch of other people that had passed away, and that essentially, there would be an angel that would enter the room, and they would either have a rose or not have a rose, and they would go up to a person, and if they didn't have a rose, they would have a sad look on their face, and they would go through a door at one end of the hall that was hell, basically. So they'd open it up and they'd have to step through it, and then you could hear the screaming and see the fire and just all that stuff. And then there would be other people that had been good people, and like the angel would come towards them with this smile on their face and give them this rose, and then they would walk through the door at the opposite end of the hall, and they would essentially be, moving on towards, heaven or rebirth or whatever you wanted to see it as, basically. And she remembers like sitting in that waiting room and just like sweating bullets, just like complete fear, because she knew all the things that she had to participate in her life, and essentially like as she's sitting there like, oh my gosh, like are they going to give me a rose or not? Like I feel like I deserve to be in hell based off of everything that I went through, and had to participate in. And she said for her, what she saw was, who came through the door was Jesus, and he had like a bouquet of roses, basically. Like he was just, so it was like this like message, from her creator that like, that she had, everything she had endured was for like, was for a reason, almost like she was like, had been sent there to do that stuff. And that, there was this level of forgiveness and stuff. And, I remember like hearing about that, and just like, I was just in this like really dark place. I was going to church a little bit at the time too. I'm not generally Christian. I'm more Buddhist, but I was trying to heal my relationship with like Jesus for certain parts and stuff. And I just remember just like feeling so lost and so just like angry at God and just like wishing that I had some sort of like understanding, like that I just needed some understanding for everything I went through, that there was like some rhyme or reason to it all, you know what I mean? Like, and understanding how to deal with that anger. And what ended up happening was that like I had like almost this, my own little vision or like dream or whatever you want to call it, that of where I was at before I was born, essentially, and how I got into this crazy, beautiful, but also very, painful and disgusting, life, existence, and everything. And what I had remembered was that I had seen, it started off with like me being on a torture table in a very typical hell setting, fire all around, people screaming, people getting tortured. I myself am like on like, a torture table getting tortured by a literal demon with like pokers and whips and all kinds of shit. And I perceived, that I had a male identity yeah, too at the time. And everything that was like completely controlling my consciousness in that moment was, I don't deserve to be here. I don't belong here, like fuck you, fuck everything, fuck the world, All I could think about was like just the overwhelming pain that I was going through and just, just complete just anger, the same level of anger that I'd felt like before having that. And it was the same level of anger, like at like God, the world, everyone, because I was in this position of such intense pain and all. That's all I could think about, is and just thinking about that there was no reason I deserved to be there. And it's like, it felt like it went on forever. And then there was this moment in that, pain where all of a sudden, for like an instant, I wasn't thinking about myself. It's like, almost like this little flash in my head. And it was this little flash in my head of like my previous life that I had before I ended up there in hell. And in that lifetime, I saw that I was a psychopath and a pedophile. And I saw this like little flash of this little like Indian boy, basically. And I had this um, this understanding of him and like understanding that I had abused him, basically. And I had just this like overwhelming like feeling of like this image of like a little flower that was just starting to like poke up from like the ground and starting to bloom, and then I come by and just like fucking rip that shit up. And then it's like in that moment it's like I saw him and what I had done to him, and then I saw it's almost like his whole life and all of the negative things that had come about by me doing, by me abusing him. I could see essentially how it had perpetuated his life being total shit and all the pain that he had then also caused on other people, essentially. And then it was almost like a dam broke. It's like I not only saw him, but I saw all the people that I had harmed in that lifetime. And then I saw lifetime after lifetime before that, where essentially, like we talked about with the, with the psychopaths descending, through their life by conscious choice more and more into becoming the psychopath until that's 100% what they are. It's like I saw each life before that it's like each life I had turned further and further away from good, had gone more and more towards self-service, so that, each incarnation I was essentially solidifying like who and what I was. Like every opportunity that had been given to me to like make the right decision, I had chosen to make the wrong one, And I just remember in that moment just feeling, myself on the torture table in hell, feeling overwhelmed with pain. And I wasn't overwhelmed with pain for what I was going through in the moment, but it was overwhelmed with the pain of seeing all of the pain that I had caused, And there was just like this instant, like crying out for the first time of help for them, that it was like all of these souls, all of these lives I could see that I had destroyed through multiple lifetimes. And I just like, it was this moment of just feeling like if there's any power out there that can do anything to help alleviate some of the harm, some of the evil that I cause in this world, all of this pain, anything that I could, any power out there that could help them, like please, it was just something that I just wanted to, like just end all that. So it was like, it was overwhelming. And I had this complete understanding at that point that I belonged exactly where I was at. You know what I mean? That it was like fucking jail for my soul, because it's like, I couldn't not harm, had just chosen over and over to be such, what I was basically. And it was like in that instance that like the physical pain of the torture completely stopped. It was overwhelmed by just this thought of everyone else. And when I cried out, it's like, it felt like in that instant, I was immediately teleported to this, out of the hell realm and into this like blank area, almost like Svali described the waiting room, just this blank area where I felt this overwhelming presence of goodness or God or whatever you want to say. And and I remember like in that instance, like being on my knees, like begging, I was like, please do something to like fix all this shit that I caused, like please, like just help them, like anything that I can do, and basically what, like, it's like I felt forgiven in that instant, and I felt like it's like all that power had wanted me to do, it was turned towards it, finally, and finally see myself through their eyes, you know what I mean? And like it was like, yes, like that's what I'm here doing, and everything. And basically like what it was presented to me that I could do was this lifetime that I have now. Basically, it was this art incarnation that essentially I was shown, like you're going to be born, you're going to incarnate in the world, and you're going to be like, you're going to be born to a pedophile, and you're going to be part of this network. And I basically got shown, basically I was like, are you okay with that? And I said, yeah. Like it wasn't like, if I have to. It was like this feeling of like overwhelming like joy and gratitude that there was something I could do. You know what I mean? Like there was just this feeling of like, yes, like get anything, just give it to me. Like I'm down, like I'm a happy and willing volunteer basically. And essentially like, they're like, are you sure? You know what I mean? And it's like I was shown like all the stuff I would go through, but I was also shown that I would heal and like, the beautiful parts of my life that I would have and everything. And it was like, you still wanted sign up for this? And I was like, yes, and for two reasons. For one, because I was shown that it was part of being a warrior for goodness and being like a step in the right direction for people and humanity and the world in general. But it was also because I knew that if I didn't say yes, that it meant some other soul was going to be born into that life, So it was a way of saving one soul from not having to go through what I did, but it was also understanding that there would be a point that I would heal and I would help others to heal, basically. And I essentially, was like, yes, of course, and so there was like, all right, there's going to be a time that your number is going to be called. So it's essentially like I went back to the hell realm for a short amount of time, but there wasn't any more physical pain. It's like I was just there waiting, still being tortured by the demon, but there wasn't any pain basically. And a short time later, it was my time to be incarnated, and I just like blipped, just like disappeared from the torture table. And one of my favorite things about this like memory or vision or whatever the fuck you want to call it was just that I remember as I was like floating away, basically, that like the demon like looked at the whip in their hand and was just kind of like, what am I doing here? So it was almost like, felt like there was like this like infectious, like this like weird infectious, almost like in that instant that demon had also kind of had this like moment of like, why am I doing this? Why am I playing this role? Kind of thing, to where it's almost like, wow. You could tell like that part of existence had started, questioning, the evil that they had committed to, and it was wild, and it gave context too, because I had, a couple of near-death experiences essentially throughout like my childhood and the abuse. And that was my experience, every time, is that, it would be a moment of out of body, of being in that same kind of neutral space with this like overwhelming love force, and them asking, like, it's that consent thing, like asking me again, like, I know shit's bad right now. Like, do you want to go back? Because you don't have to unless you want to, And like, and every time I was like, dude, if, it'd be like, if there's a job to do, then yes, I want to go back. And that's also where I've gotten some, love for the persecutor parts and the parts that, because they are the parts that took on the most trauma by choosing to be the psychopath, because that is what had to get me through to survive eventually. You know what I mean? Is choose they doing what the abusers wanted and being what the abusers wanted. It's like they did bear the heaviest burden of all my parts, because they had to, really dissociate all of the goodness that we understand now gives us so much strength, and just, commit themselves to what. So, I mean, and then the other thing that I got from it, was understanding too that, like, because I always had like a lot of like guilt around the victims, that I hadn't been able to save or that I had participated in. And it was also kind of this understanding of karmic understanding that, like, even those, like, that I should take the guilt off of my own shoulders, that on a certain level, those individuals, chose to play that role, essentially because it was something that they felt like they had to do to save another soul from it, but also so that their own soul could heal on a certain level. And this is where it gets weird, because this is not at all excusing any behavior, but I'm just saying that um, you know, that, goodness sees the bigger picture and is like doing like what it needs, in the grand scheme of things to, like, to move us where we need to go, all of us, all of our souls collectively, humanity, etc., and it's like, and it's, the evil is not unseen, and it's constantly being worked with, like, without having to violate free will, because ultimately that is goodness, is like, if we're all forced into being good, and that's what my anger was about initially, why I was asking, like, how this stuff is possible, is like, because ultimately, goodness is not about coercing, is not about forcing anything. So it's like there's this long timeline, this bigger timeline that we have to really understand, is moving us in the right direction, and having all the demons choose to turn away from the darkness and turn towards the light, and that is where we're moving. But yeah, I mean, so that's a lot of like my motivation that I don't talk about, obviously, with stuff, because it's, people could say I'm crazy and that's just some woo woo shit and everything. But I know for me, it, was one of the hugest points in my healing, in turning towards stability, despite all of the, like dealing with all the memories of the ritual abuse and organized abuse and the violence and all that kind of stuff, was getting a different perspective on it, and experiencing self-forgiveness, and just understanding that, like, it's part of what gave me the motivation that I had to really, focus on advocacy as part of, not just my own healing, but the way that I can try and help other people that are in this situation, either that are healing from it or that are still, like, ultimately that's my goal, is to prevent any kid that's currently in it, be able to start moving the needle to where, they can get out, and to prevent future, ones that haven't even born yet, that it will eventually be sold into the system, that it's the awareness, so I don't know.
You're teaching others too to be able to spot it, and then we can save the kids that are where it's happening now. It's just so important that you're here. I'm so glad.
Like, I've experienced a lot of beauty in my life, especially since, like, finally dealing with stuff and healing, and my son especially, is like,
Right.
Obviously is like the number one, like, gift that I never thought I would have, basically. Like, he's just an amazement every day, and there is that pure love there that a lot of most parents experience, and it's but it also gives, like, meaning to the suffering to a degree, you know, and just, you know, I don't know how to describe it.
We can
It's
understand it now.
I can understand it, and it's like, and I feel like, you know, a lot of people look for their purpose in life, and it's like I feel like I already have mine, you know, like it's something
Right.
that I feel exponentially, and I understand that, like, if I were, you know, like if I were to die tomorrow, that it's like you know, maybe I haven't done everything I had goals about, you know, and including in this area, but it's like that I feel like you know, I've done to a degree like what I needed to do, you know, in this
Right.
life, and I'm going to continue doing it, you know. But it is a sense of like peace of understanding that it's like there's, you know, there's a lot of beauty out there, like outside of this world too, and it's like that, you know, I don't know how to describe it. It's a um despite all the horror, you know, it's way more beautiful than it is dark. That's for sure.
It's, it's important to get, like, even in our own life, we can come to understandings of like, oh, yeah, I guess I did deserve to go to jail, or oh, yeah, like, and then you feel bad for the other, like people that take a big dose of mushrooms sometimes, like they just think about how they hurt others and they just cry. Like, I mean, I've been there, you know. um I'm not like exactly, but I mean, I've cried from the mushrooms. Like I've had that, like going back through my mom memory of like all the times I've hurt others, and like, oh, you know, like, um,
I think entheogens are just another one of like the tools of like,
very,
you
yeah,
know, the universe and goodness to really help people to feel that, you know, that interconnectedness really. Like
right,
I know of people in my own life that were going down a bad path, you know what I mean, of selfishness and different stuff, and started doing hallucinations and ended up better people on the other side of
right.
it, you know, because they you know,
To
they were
care
able
for
to have that
others,
ego dissolution to the
right?
point where they could really, you know, finally understand, you know, compassion and empathy, and you know, and all these things, and you know,
Yes,
feel that connection to a bigger source than themselves,
yes.
way more than, you know, they had been before. So you know, I'm a
So
proponent of agents in certain situations for sure.
me too, me too. This, like you mentioned, you lean towards Buddhism, but what you described, um, I've learned about in Buddhist teachings. The the beast that does the torture in the hell realm is uh, is like is an angel in a way, because it's doing its job. You know, it's helping people to recognize their problem. You know,
One of my favorite lamas, yeah, he describes the hell realm as like a hospital for your
mm,
soul. Basically, you know, it's like a place where, you know, you may have to have some painful procedures to get better again, you know, and
right,
it's like, you know, it's true. It's like it's and I think depending on how bad of a person you are determines how long you need to be there before you've, like, you know, in Buddhism they
right,
talk about, you know, expend your negative karma, you know, basically like to the point where it's like almost like, you know, a detox, you know what I mean, of
right.
all the negative, all the ego that got you there to where you can finally
Discharging the
see.
battery. Yeah,
Yeah, so you can finally see and get some understanding of the pain that you caused, and have
right.
like, some identification with that, and a desire not to do it, not to continue to
Right.
do it, because
Change
not
of the
because
will
yeah,
towards
not because
helping
you're
the
being like
others.
exactly, not because you're being like forced to from an external locus of control, like you got to, you know, like a daddy punishing you, that's like, you know, I better be a
Right.
good boy from now, but it's more, but it's an internal transformation where you're
Right.
actually seeing that pain and choosing like, oh, I don't want to be a bad person anymore. Not I'm not being forced to be a good person, but I literally just like, I never want to cause that harm. Like now I understand how much harm I caused, would really and viscerally feel it, and I never want to do it again, because I understand others' pain is my own pain, and why would I, you know, there wouldn't even be the motivation anymore, you know.
Right. And that's healing. That's healing the world. I mean, you telling us these things about mind control and abuse of children and demonization of victims like this, you are teaching all of us, and we can all heal too with that understanding that you are like, I guess I can't really describe it. Like you are giving us the chance to learn the lessons that you are having and to apply that in our own way towards ourself, and to have a better understanding of how the mind works and how others operate, like psychopathy in general, and like, and then we can learn like the structure of the hierarchy of power, and like the obedience to evil, and like, and you're teaching us about the consent, and like demons think they have a right to do, like, you know, like they think they have a right to occupy this thing, like this person, a victim, like they believe that they should be there, and you know, like you're teaching us what is going on, like everything, like all of this, like this, it's so much, it's helping, your this chance of incarnating is not only helping the ones that are abused, like you, is you're also helping us, and you're helping all of us with ears, all of us that are humans that hear. I mean,
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, so are you. And, like, so are all of us. Like, that is like,
Yeah.
that's like the shamanic part of humans being humans and sharing their stories, you know? Like, it's,
Yeah.
my channel and advocacy was very much motivated by how I got sober and learned in AA how powerful it could be. Like, just one person sharing, people just being honest and sharing their stories, and the way it creates that transformation and helps move people towards healing and you know, in that case, sobriety and different stuff, and the better version of themselves, just by, you know, and I still am convinced that's, you know, that's most of it's, like, you know, that God, the universe, speaks to us through other people, you know, and it's, so it's not just, you know, people have done the same for me, like you do the same for me, and it's like we all kind of are doing the same thing on, you know, different levels, you know, in different areas. So
I'm so glad to be here doing it with you. We are all living our lives, living the brightest and best possible. Please, everybody needs to visit Desert Dakini on YouTube, and look forward to your future works. You're going to be speaking about introjects and inanimate objects, and going further into the Monarch specified science of mind control. And I mean, I look forward to all of that. Thank you so much. And I've had you for many hours here, and thank you so much for giving your time. Is there anything else that you'd like to say to listeners before we go?
no, just thank you for tuning in here to Sean. He's like a super um moral, super, you know, balanced individual. You're like a warrior on the side of good, you know, and everything, and fantastic researcher, and you know, family man and everything. So you know, and someone who's willing to give me and other survivors a voice and a platform, you know, to stand on, to tell our stories. You know, it's like we couldn't do it without someone like you. So yeah, if you want more healing stuff, check out my channel. If you want more testimony stuff, I got, you know, plenty of stuff out there, including all the episodes that we've done together. And yeah, I mean, just thanks for listening, you know, to all this and being open to it.
Um, like these conversations transform my heart and mind. Like this is like, I'm so thankful to be able to speak with you, and I'm so glad it's recorded and people can listen. Thank you again, and I look forward to the next time we speak. And thank you, listeners, for listening. We will see you next time on Wake the Dead.